people who inhabited the Dakota Badlands centuries ago called these regions their mother, saying it provided nourishment for their tribes. At the same time, Magellan was circling the planet and Henry VIII was marrying and decapitating wives, the Lakotas migrated to the upper Midwest from the Ohio Valley. Their life was simple, based on a belief the white buffalo calf woman came to Earth and gave them the four winds. It was here that many famous names in American history came to be: Sitting Bull, Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and Spotted Tail. In 1883, Theodore Roosevelt visited North Dakota and decided to settle here to hunt buffalo, but there was hardly any left. So he bought a ranch near Medora to try his hand at cattle ranching. While his ranch house was being built, he returned to New York and continued his work as a state politician. In 1884, Roosevelt's wife of 4 years gave birth on February 12th. They lived with his widowed mother. 2 days later, on Valentine's Day, his mother died of typhoid fever. 11 hours after that, his wife died of kidney failure. Roosevelt was crushed when he marked the day with an X in his diary. Grieving, he retired from politics later that year and returned to the North Dakota ranch to try and follow his dream of being a cowboy. What he saw was ranchers flooding the prairie with cattle, which he predicted was an impending disaster. Sure enough, a rough winter in 1886 killed tens of thousands of cattle, about 80% of the total bovine population. Then, during the following spring in 1887, the Little Missouri River flooded from the melting snow and ice, washing tons of cattle carcasses downstream. Shortly after that, Roosevelt abandoned his ranching dreams. He sold his ranch and few remaining cattle and returned to New York. The 2 ranches he worked became the Theodore Roosevelt National Memorial Park right after World War II. It was the only national memorial park ever established. Memorial was dropped from the name in 1978. The park is split into 3 parts: a north unit near Watford City, and a south unit about 80 miles away near Medora and I-94. The Elkhorn Ranch unit is roughly midway between those 2 larger sections and only accessible on gravel roads. Connecting all 3 parts is the Little Missouri River and the Little Missouri River National Grassland. Roosevelt found it hard to find buffalo to hunt 130 years ago, but today the bison cover much of the landscape. That is just an example of how this land has changed over time. 1 billion years ago, scientists say this area was first coated with sediment from mountain runoffs. Erosion deposited fertile soils from the high mountains bordering the flat plains. Most of that time, the plains remained above sea level, but for a while, about 200 million years ago, the shallow Sundance Sea covered much of the interior plains. Periodic floods carried more sediment across the region when the seabed dried up as the dinosaurs roamed the Dakota prairie. Then, 100 million years ago, sea levels rose again and flooded the continent's interior. The sediment and dinosaur skeletons were buried in the seabed across the landscape. Millennium upon millennium of erosion continued until about 2 million years ago, when huge sheets of ice developed and covered much of North America. That ice scraped the interior plain flat between the Missouri and Ohio rivers, creating what we call the Great Plains, where the park is located. Those layers of soil in the park, piled up over the course of hundreds of millions of years, are being exposed by water and a wind that seems to almost never stop blowing. The result of that erosion looks like earth piled upon earth, like a layered cake awaiting its frosting, surrounded by flat fields, covered in grass, scrub, and cottonwood trees along the creeks and rivers. Both park units have scenic drives along the canyons and plains. The smaller North Unit's drive is 14 miles long to a dead end. The South Unit's loop passes just more than 35 miles of dramatic landscape. Prairie dog towns dot the roadsides as the furry creatures bark and dig and scurry about. Buffalo herds meander over the prairies, sometimes blocking roads and creating Kodak moments for curious visitors. Herds of feral horses graze in the canyons. A small group of about 14 longhorn steers are maintained in the park's northern section to demonstrate how the landscape looked to the man who became America's 26th president. The park has a vast expanse of prairies and badlands with a long history, and slowly it continues to morph into something new, something that may not look anything like it does today in the long-distant tomorrow, just as it has changed drastically from the distant yesterday.